The desert evening settled over the town like a quilt stitched in silence, every fold of shadow stretched across the ground as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Heat lingered in the air, the day's dust still clinging to the creases of wooden storefronts and the weathered grain of fence posts. From the north came the faint smell of mesquite smoke, drifting over the rooftops, settling into the hollows where lantern light flickered against glass. The cicadas had begun their steady clicking, a low hum that filled the spaces where people no longer dared to speak openly, and in a small cabin at the edge of town, she sat at a rough pine table with a sheet of paper in front of her. Her name was Clara, though many no longer said it. They called her that woman, or else lowered their voices altogether when she walked past. She had been gone once before, left for the city with dreams folded neatly in her hands, only to return years later carrying silence heavier than any bundle. Now she lived alone, and her days followed a rhythm she had constructed as carefully as a wall, fetching water, mending, stitching small comforts into hours that otherwise threatened to unravel. To the outside eye, she looked composed, her dark hair pinned back, her posture always upright, but beneath that quiet surface lay a pulse of fear that never slowed. Tonight it beat faster than ever. The lantern threw its amber circle across the table, and the pen trembled between her fingers. She had written 3 words already, "You promised to," and then stopped. The paper seemed too thin to carry the weight she meant to press upon it. The ink blotted, her hesitation leaving a mark that spread like a bruise. At last she drew a breath, steadying herself as though bracing against wind, and wrote the rest. "Protect me, tonight they'll kill me." Her throat tightened as she read it over. The words looked both desperate and final, as though they carried the sound of her heartbeat across miles. She signed no name, he would know. Folding the page with hands that shook, she pressed it closed against her chest for a long moment before slipping it into an envelope. There was no certainty it would reach him in time, perhaps not at all. Yet doing nothing meant surrendering. She was not ready to surrender, not yet. The chair creaked when she stood. She crossed the small room, set the envelope upon the sill where the boy from town would find it come morning. The night air pressed through the gaps in the window frame, dry and sharp, carrying with it the far-off laughter of men drinking at the saloon. Clara shivered though the heat had not yet lifted. She knew whose laughter it was. The threats had begun quietly, almost like gossip itself, murmured warnings, lingering stares. Then came the messages scrawled on her door, the silence of neighbors who no longer looked her in the eye. And yesterday, when she walked back from the well, a rider passed close enough that the horse's breath struck her cheek. He leaned from the saddle, his words low and cutting, "Tomorrow night." Nothing more. She had not slept since. Now she stood in the dim room, her palms pressed flat to the wood of the sill, and thought of him. Matthew. His name filled her mind like the sudden swell of a hymn, unwanted yet undeniable. She had left him years ago, believing that distance might offer them safety, or perhaps freedom from each other's longing. She had been wrong. She had lived every day since with the shape of his absence. He had loved her without asking, and she had walked away because she feared the weight of belonging, feared what this town would say if she chose him when her family had already marked her as reckless. She had believed she could start over elsewhere. She had only found herself haunted. And now, with the threat circling closer, she had written him. She had asked for his protection though she had forfeited any claim to it. She could picture his face when he read the words, stern, worn, eyes narrowing as though gauging a distance he could not ignore. If he came, it would not be for romance, not for forgiveness. He would come because he had given his word once, and Matthew Kane was a man who carried his word like iron at his side. Clara pressed her forehead to the cool window pane, letting her breath cloud the glass. The town beyond lay quiet, yet she felt the weight of watching. Even in silence, she knew they were speaking of her. Each woman who drew her child closer when Clara passed, each man who spat into the dust as she crossed the street, all of them had judged her return as proof that she carried shame like a contagion. And perhaps she did. Yet when she remembered the touch of Matthew's hand steadying her once, years ago, in the chaos of a street fight, she felt that shame falter. The clock ticked softly against the far wall. Midnight approached. She would not sleep. She lit another lamp, trimmed its wick, tried to read but found the words sliding from the page. At last she set the book aside and let her hands busy themselves with mending, a shirt she no longer wore, its fabric fraying at the cuffs. Each stitch was too tight, her fingers too clumsy. The needle pricked her skin, a bead of blood rising bright against pale flesh. She pressed her thumb to it and thought again of him, somewhere out there in the dark, perhaps asleep beside a dwindling fire. Perhaps already on the road. Miles away in a cabin no larger than hers, Matthew did not sleep either. The letter had reached him by a rider who did not wait to explain. He sat alone, the page unfolded on his knee, the words stark in the lamplight. His jaw worked but no sound came. He read the line again, then again, until the ink blurred. Finally he rose, opened the trunk at the foot of his bed, and lifted out the gun he had not touched in months. The metal felt cold, foreign, yet right in his hand. He checked the chamber, slid it into his holster, and stood before the door. No speech marked the moment, no gesture of farewell. Only the creak of hinges as he stepped into the night, a shadow among shadows, riding toward her. Back in Clara's cabin, time thinned like thread. She set aside her sewing, extinguished the lamp, and sat by the window where the moon hung low above the ridge. Her thoughts refused to settle. Every creak of the boards outside might be a step, every gust of wind a warning. She waited, though she told herself she was only keeping watch. She would not allow her hope to rise, not yet. The town's silence deepened. Even the saloon laughter had faded, leaving only the faint cry of a coyote across the flats. Clara leaned her head against the frame and closed her eyes for the briefest moment, her body weary beyond words. When she opened them again, she caught the faint outline of movement far down the road, a figure astride a horse, slow, deliberate. Her heart thudded once, hard enough that she pressed a hand against her chest. She could not yet be sure. She dared not be sure. The rider approached with the patience of someone who had measured distance all his life. When at last the horse stopped at her gate, Clara did not move. She could only watch as he dismounted, tied the reins with careful fingers, and lifted his face toward her window. The lantern inside caught enough of his features to banish doubt. It was him. For an instant she remained frozen, as though time itself had stopped to ask her permission. Then she opened the door. The night air swept between them, filled with dust and the faint scent of sage. He did not smile, nor did she. Their eyes met, and in that gaze lay all the years between, the leaving, the silence, the letter that had bridged what pride could not. He spoke first, his voice low, steady as a river stone. "I'm here." It was not a promise, not a plea. Only presence, offered plain. Clara's throat tightened, her reply catching before it could form. She lowered her eyes, then raised them again, allowing herself to look fully at him. The weight in her chest shifted, not yet lightened, but no longer hers alone to carry. Behind them, the desert night deepened. Somewhere in that darkness, danger was still moving closer, inevitable as dawn. Yet for the first time in many months, Clara did not feel alone in waiting for it. The doorway framed him as though he had stepped out of the dark itself, the night pressed close behind his shoulders, his silhouette cut against the lamplight. Clara held the door open only a fraction, the wood trembling faintly under her hand. She had not seen Matthew in years, yet in an instant it was as though those years collapsed, leaving only the raw fact of him standing there, taller than she remembered, hair darker, lined with dust and silence. His eyes searched her face without haste, and the weight of that gaze made her feel both steadied and exposed. For a moment she could not move. The fear that had drawn the letter from her hands just hours ago still clung to her skin, and she wondered if she had imagined his presence, conjured him out of desperation. But then he spoke again, quiet enough that the sound seemed meant only for her. "Are you safe?" The question was plain, stripped of ceremony, but the sound of it cracked something inside her chest. She stepped back, allowing him through the threshold, and closed the door behind him. The latch clicked into place, a fragile barrier against a world that had already decided her fate. Inside, the cabin looked smaller with him in it. He stood near the table, glancing at the unwashed cup beside the lamp, the neat pile of sewing, the envelope box stacked with scraps she never mailed. His presence filled the air not with noise but with a stillness she had not known she longed for. Clara busied her hands to hide their shaking, gathering the loose fabric, folding it, setting it aside. She feared if she looked at him too long she might speak something she could not take back. "You came," she whispered, though she had not meant to say it aloud. His eyes lifted to hers, steady, unflinching. "You asked." Nothing more. No reproach, no mention of years lost. He simply acknowledged the call and his answer to it, as if the bond between them had never been severed. Clara lowered herself onto the chair, her fingers tightening around its worn edge. He remained standing, hat still in his hand, waiting with a patience that unnerved her. "You shouldn't have," she murmured. "I gave my word." The simplicity of it cut through her defenses. He said it without pride, without demand for gratitude. For Matthew, words once given became law, and she had known that even as she ran from him. Perhaps she had counted on it when she wrote the letter, though admitting as much made her feel small. He set his hat upon the table, the gesture deliberate, a kind of quiet claim that he was not passing through. Then he moved to the door frame where the wood hung crooked and pressed against it. The hinge groaned. Without asking, he pulled a small tool from his coat, knelt and began to work at the screws. Clara watched in silence, her breath shallow. It struck her then how his presence was not thunder but stone, a grounded weight that reshaped the air around him. She found herself studying the way his fingers moved, firm, unhurried, as though the task itself mattered as much as any battle. The sight made her throat ache. Here was a man who fixed things not with words but with patience, who mended even what she had believed broken beyond repair. When he finished, he rose, brushed the dust from his hands and glanced toward her again. "Won't come off so easy now," he said. Clara swallowed. It was only the wind that bothered it. He shook his head slightly. "Not the wind you need to worry about." Her breath faltered. There was no need to name the danger. She had written it plainly. "Tonight they'll kill me." The men who had made the threat were not far, and Matthew's presence did not erase that truth. It only meant she no longer faced it alone. Still, she felt the old hesitation rise. Once before she had chosen to leave, to refuse the safety he offered because she feared what it would cost her. Even now she could not bring herself to meet his eyes for long. She rose and moved toward the stove, striking a match, busying her hands with coffee. The routine gave her shelter, though she knew he saw through it. The kettle hissed, steam curling into the dim air. She poured the coffee into 2 cups, set one in front of him. For a breath their fingers nearly touched on the handle, but he withdrew quickly, deliberate as ever. The restraint in that small motion undid her more than touch might have. She sat opposite, the table between them holding silence heavier than any conversation. "You shouldn't have come," she said again, softer this time, almost like an apology. Matthew sipped, his eyes fixed on the steam. "You knew I would." The words pressed against her ribs like truth too sharp to deny. She forced herself to speak, though each word felt like a stone laid bare. "It was my choice to leave. I had no right." He cut her off gently, not with anger but with the finality of a man who saw no use in revisiting roads already traveled. "Doesn't matter. You asked. That's enough." Her lips parted, then closed again. She realized then that he was not offering her absolution, nor demanding explanation. He had come because she was in danger. Nothing more. Perhaps nothing less. The night outside thickened. From beyond the shuttered windows came the occasional creak of boards, the shift of wind, the echo of hooves on distant road. Clara stiffened at each sound, her hands tightening around the cup. Matthew remained still, listening as though cataloging every noise, measuring threat by instinct. She found herself drawing steadiness from his calm. The town, meanwhile, had already begun to whisper. When Matthew's horse passed the saloon earlier, men leaned from their stools, muttering, exchanging knowing looks. Word spread fast in a place where gossip clung like smoke. "He came back for her," someone said. "After all that? Fool man. By morning the whole town would know, and judgment would sharpen like knives." Clara imagined their eyes following her, imagined the children repeating words they'd overheard from parents. She felt the weight of it pressing already, yet in this cabin, with Matthew seated across from her, she almost believed she could bear it. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely more than breath. He looked at her then, truly looked, and the years seemed to dissolve in that gaze. "Do you?" She could not answer. Her hands tightened around the cup, the heat searing her palms. Regret was too small a word for what she carried. She closed her eyes, and in the silence that followed, she heard the faint scrape of his chair as he stood. He crossed the room, not with haste but with the certainty of someone who knew the ground beneath his feet. He stopped near the fire, staring into it for a long while. The glow touched the sharp planes of his face, softened the lines of wear. Clara remained at the table, her body rigid, waiting for something she could not name. When he finally spoke, the words came like stone dropped into water. "When it comes, I'll be here. But you have to decide if you want that." The statement struck her with more force than any threat. He was not asking for love, not demanding trust, only placing the choice in her hands. Her breath came shallow, and for a moment she could not look at him. She rose instead, moving to the corner where his coat had fallen across a chair. The sleeve hung torn, a seam ripped. She picked it up, needle and thread still on the table, and began to mend. Her fingers shook at first, then steadied, each stitch deliberate. She did not answer his words aloud. The act itself became her reply. Matthew turned from the fire, watching her without interrupting. His silence felt less like distance now, more like respect. She worked until the seam closed, tied the thread, and folded the coat across the chair once more. Only then did she lift her gaze, meeting his eyes across the room. Neither spoke. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and in that quiet something shifted, fragile but real. For the first time since she had returned, Clara felt a sliver of safety, not because danger had passed but because she was no longer bracing against it alone. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. The sound reminded her of what waited beyond the walls, of riders who had promised her death. But within the cabin, the night held steady. Matthew settled back into his chair, his hand resting lightly on the revolver at his side, not out of threat but readiness. Clara sat again, folding her hands, her eyes lingering on the rosebush outside the window where moonlight traced its fragile outline. She thought of the buds that had yet to open, delicate against the desert air, and felt the smallest flicker of resolve kindle within her. The silence between them stretched, not empty but full, a bridge forming across the years they had lost. Clara leaned back, letting her breath slow, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt the weight in her chest ease. Tomorrow would bring its reckoning. But tonight, for a few fleeting hours, she allowed herself the fragile peace of knowing she was not alone. Dawn crept into the town with a pale light that bled slowly across the horizon, softening the edges of rooftops and dust roads. Clara stood at the window of her cabin, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching as the first stirrings of life began beyond the glass. The blacksmith opened his doors with a heavy clatter, the smell of coal already drifting into the cool air. A woman across the street swept her porch, her broom scratching in sharp strokes. Yet even in these ordinary sounds, Clara sensed a tension beneath the surface, like a string drawn too taut. She glanced behind her. Matthew was seated at the table, his elbows resting on the worn wood, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The revolver lay beside him, gleaming faintly in the weak morning light. He had not slept, though he never complained of it. She wondered if he had spent every night of his life this way, ready to rise at the first sound, always prepared for trouble. "You should rest," she said quietly. He shook his head without looking at her. "Not yet." There was nothing more to say. Clara pressed her palms against the sill, grounding herself in the texture of the wood, the roughness against her skin. The silence between them was not awkward but heavy, filled with all the words neither dared to speak. She thought of how once, long ago, their exchanges had been filled with easy laughter, small jokes shared under the weight of desert stars. Now every word seemed carved from stone, deliberate, shaped by necessity. When she stepped outside later that morning, she felt the eyes upon her. Townsfolk lingered longer in doorways as she passed, their conversations halting. She heard fragments, "Back with him is she?" and "Doesn't learn that one." The whispers pressed against her like grit beneath the skin, irritating, relentless. Clara held her chin steady, though inside her chest every murmur landed sharp. She had thought perhaps the town's judgment might ease with time, but Matthew's return had only fanned the embers. At the well, two women she had once called friends turned their backs, buckets clanging as they left without a greeting. Clara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue, lowering her pail into the water with steady hands. She told herself the rhythm of the task mattered more than the sting of their absence. When she pulled the bucket up again, she caught sight of Matthew in the distance, leaning against the fence, arms folded. He did not interfere, did not come closer, but his presence steadied her like an anchor beneath shifting tides. Later, back at the cabin, Clara knelt by the small rosebush she had planted weeks earlier. Its stem was thin, its leaves dust-covered, but a single bud had begun to form, pale against the harsh soil. She brushed her fingers gently across the petals, careful not to crush them. Something about the fragile bloom filled her with both hope and fear. Could anything so delicate survive in a place like this? She thought of herself then, and the parallel was too plain to ignore. Matthew approached, his boots crunching against gravel. He paused beside her, looking down at the plant without speaking. She could feel his gaze, steady and unreadable, and for a moment she wanted him to say something, anything, that might give her certainty. But when he did not, she rose, dusting her hands against her skirt, and met his eyes. "They'll come," she said softly. He nodded. "Soon." No false comfort, no denial. Just truth. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Matthew spent his hours repairing what he could, patching fences, oiling the hinges of the door he had already fixed, chopping wood though the weather did not yet demand it. Clara watched him sometimes, unnoticed, struck by the steadiness of his hands, the way he moved without waste. At night he sat near the fire, his revolver always within reach, while Clara mended clothing or stirred broth. Words between them were few, but each gesture carried weight. When she set a cup before him, he accepted it with a nod that lingered. When he brushed dust from his boots before stepping into her home, she saw the quiet respect of the act. But outside, the whispers grew sharper. Men at the saloon spoke openly now, their voices carrying into the street. She thinks he'll save her? Won't change what's coming. Children mimicked their parents' disdain, pointing, laughing when Clara walked past. Even the sheriff stopped her once, his hand heavy on her arm. Best to leave town again, he told her. Man like Cain only draws trouble. Clara pulled free, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. Trouble was here long before he came back. She walked away without looking back, though she felt the sheriff's gaze on her until she disappeared down the road. That evening, Clara sat by the window as the sun lowered, watching the horizon darken. Matthew entered quietly as he always did, and placed his hat on the table. The silence stretched, and then he spoke, his tone practical, even. When the time comes, it won't be easy. You need to know that. Clara turned to him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I know. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as though weighing her resolve. At last he gave a short nod, accepting her answer. Clara exhaled, though her chest still felt bound. Later, when she reached for his coat draped across the chair, she noticed the seam she had mended earlier. Her fingers brushed the stitches and she felt the thread hold firm. Something in her tightened. She realized then that her choice was already made. She would not run. The following morning brought a different kind of tension. Clara awoke to find Matthew outside, sharpening a blade against a whetstone, the sound grating in the stillness. She stepped onto the porch, the hem of her dress brushing against the wood, and he glanced up briefly before returning to his work. They're close, he said simply. Her breath caught. How do you know? Tracks by the ridge. Fresh. Fear curled in her stomach, but she steadied her voice. What do we do? He met her eyes, the steel glinting faintly in his hand. Wait. The word felt like a stone dropped into her chest. Waiting meant vulnerability, meant surrendering the hours to dread. Yet she saw in his face that he trusted patience more than haste, and she chose to believe in that. Throughout the day, Clara felt the unease ripple through town. Doors stayed shut longer, shutters drawn. People hurried their errands, eyes downcast. She caught sight of the same rider who had threatened her days earlier, his horse standing at the edge of the street, dust rising with each restless step. He did not approach, but his stare lingered. Clara forced herself not to look away. Back at the cabin, her nerves frayed. She busied herself with cooking though neither of them was hungry, with sweeping though the floor was already clean. Matthew said nothing, but she knew he saw her restlessness. At last he stood, crossed the room, and set a hand on the back of her chair. Not touching her, not holding her, only resting there, an anchor. The simple gesture quieted her more than words could have. That night she could not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the steady sound of Matthew's breathing from the chair where he kept watch. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting pale lines across the floor. Clara turned onto her side, her eyes finding the outline of the rosebush outside. The bud had opened, fragile petals spread wide despite the unforgiving air. She closed her eyes, holding the image like a talisman. The following morning she stepped into town beside Matthew. Conversations halted at their approach, eyes followed them from every porch. Clara felt the judgment in every glance, but she lifted her head higher, walking not behind him but beside him. The simple act sent a ripple through her chest, a quiet defiance she had not expected. At the general store, whispers followed them. She thinks standing with him will save her. Fool woman. Clara met their stares and did not flinch. Matthew bought supplies without comment, his manner unchanged, but she felt the weight of his presence like a shield. When they returned to the cabin, Clara paused at the door, her heart racing. She turned to him, words trembling at the edge of her lips. Why do you stay? She asked. He studied her, his gaze unreadable. Because you asked. She felt the breath catch in her throat. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any declaration. She realized then that love was not spoken but lived, not promised but shown in presence, in patience, in the willingness to stand when others turned away. As evening fell, Clara knelt once more by the rosebush, brushing dust from its petals. Matthew stood nearby, silent. The sky burned with streaks of crimson, the air heavy with the promise of what was coming. Clara touched the fragile bloom, and for the first time in years, she felt the faint stir of strength not borrowed from another, but rising from within herself. The sound of hooves carried faintly from the ridge, distant but unmistakable. Clara rose slowly, her hand lingering on the rose as if drawing courage from it. She turned to Matthew, and though fear pressed against her ribs, her voice was steady. "They're coming." He nodded once, calm as ever. "Then we'll be ready." The night closed around them, heavy with silence, holding its breath for what lay ahead. The sky bruised as the day fell into night, violet and copper fading into shadow. Clara stood at the window, her breath fogging faintly against the glass, watching the horizon burn down to embers. Beyond the ridge the desert stretched endless, yet her eyes searched for movement, for any flicker of dust that might betray riders drawing near. The silence in the cabin pressed heavy, broken only by the faint creak of wood as the wind brushed against the walls. Behind her, Matthew checked the revolver. The sound of the cylinder clicking into place was soft, deliberate, yet it filled the room like thunder. He handled the weapon with the same quiet precision he used to mend a hinge or sharpen a blade, each motion measured, each pause intentional. Clara watched him, her chest tightening at the sight. She had known he would face whatever danger came, but to see it made tangible in his hands left her heart unsteady. "They'll come tonight," she said, though he had already told her as much. He nodded, sliding the gun back into its holster. "They will." The certainty in his tone sent a shiver along her spine. There was no false hope here, no pretense that fate might be delayed. Only inevitability. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter and turned away from the window, her gaze falling to the rosebush outside, barely visible in the dusk. The single bloom quivered against the gathering wind. She pressed her hand against the glass as though to steady it from afar, and then let her fingers drop. In town, the saloon was louder than usual. Clara had passed by earlier, her ears catching the sharp bursts of laughter, the clang of glasses, the harsh bravado of men who had no intention of lifting a finger when blood was spilled. Their mockery hung in her mind even now. "Let Cain play hero. Won't last the night." She had walked quickly, her cheeks hot, but inside she had felt the words carved deeper than she wanted to admit. Now, with night thickening, she knew those same men would be listening for gunfire, waiting to see if she survived. The town had placed its bet on her ruin. Only Matthew had stepped forward, not with promises but with presence. The weight of that choice pressed on her, heavy yet strangely liberating. Matthew poured water into 2 cups and set one before her. Clara wrapped her hands around it, though she did not drink. Her fingers trembled and she clenched them tighter, willing the shake to still. He noticed but said nothing. His silence felt like steadiness now, not absence. She drew strength from it. The hours stretched. Shadows thickened. The desert beyond the window seemed to listen, waiting. Clara tried to busy her hands with sewing, but the thread slipped from her grasp, the needle pricking her skin. She set it aside, staring at the tiny bead of blood as though it might foretell something larger. Matthew remained at the table, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the door, toward the window, always listening. Alas, the sound came. Hooves, faint at first, then heavier, the rhythm unmistakable against the packed dirt road. Clara's breath caught. Her pulse quickened until she thought it might choke her. She rose, moving instinctively closer to Matthew, though she did not touch him. He stood, his body straightening, his hand resting lightly on the revolver. Through the window she glimpsed them, dark shapes emerging from the ridge, dust trailing behind. 3 no for riders, their outlines blurred in the dim light. They slowed as they reached the edge of town, pausing as though savoring the hush that spread before them. No townsfolk appeared in the streets. Doors stayed shut, curtains drawn. Only silence greeted the men, a silence heavy with complicity. Clara's throat tightened. She thought of the sheriff's words, the way neighbors had turned their backs, the laughter in the saloon. They had abandoned her, abandoned them both, leaving this night to play out like some grim spectacle. Matthew moved toward the door. Clara's hand shot out, clutching his sleeve before she could stop herself. He looked back, his gaze steady, unreadable. "You don't have to," she whispered. "Yes, I do." The finality in his tone settled over her. She let go. He opened the door and stepped into the night. The air outside was sharp, tinged with dust and the faint scent of gun oil. Clara followed him to the threshold, her heart pounding, her body trembling though she forced herself upright. She would not hide. Not tonight. The riders approached slowly, their horses snorting, hoofs striking the earth in unison. The leader, a broad man with a scar cutting across his cheek, reined his horse to a stop a few yards away. His grin was wide, cruel, glinting in the lantern light that spilled from Clara's cabin. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Didn't think you had the sense to call for company, girl?" His eyes shifted to Matthew, his smirk deepening. "Cain. Thought you'd have more sense than to tie yourself to a lost cause." Matthew said nothing. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, but he did not draw. The silence between them stretched, heavy, until the men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Clara stood in the doorway, the shawl clutched tightly around her, her voice locked in her throat. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words would not come. The leader's grin faltered under Matthew's steady gaze. He spat into the dust, trying to reclaim his bravado. "You planning to die for her?" Matthew's voice, when it came, was quiet, unshaken. "Planning to keep my word." The simplicity of it hung in the air, heavier than any threat. The leader's expression hardened. He raised his hand, a signal. The riders shifted, hands moving to weapons. In that instant, everything seemed to slow. The horses' restless snorts, the creak of leather, the faint rustle of wind through the brush. Clara's heart hammered so loudly she thought it might drown the world. Then, without hesitation, Matthew drew. The first shot cracked the silence like lightning, echoing off the wooden fronts of empty stores. One rider pitched backward, falling into the dust. Chaos erupted. Gunfire split the night, flashes sparking, smoke rising. Horses reared, hooves striking sparks against stone. Clara ducked instinctively, then forced herself upright, refusing to retreat into the shadows. She stepped into the doorway, her eyes locked on Matthew's form as he moved with precision. Each shot measured, each motion deliberate. He did not waste movement, did not fire blindly. He fought like a man who had carried this weight before, who had long ago accepted its cost. One of the riders swung his weapon toward the cabin. Clara's breath caught. Without thinking, she seized the lantern from the table and hurled it through the open door. It shattered against the man's chest, flames flaring briefly before he tumbled from his horse. The act left her hands shaking, her chest heaving, but she did not look away. The leader cursed, dismounting, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He leveled his gun at Matthew, fury twisting his features. Clara's voice broke free at last, raw but steady. "Enough." The shout carried across the chaos, startling even herself. The leader's eyes flicked toward her, and in that sliver of distraction Matthew fired. The man staggered, dropped his weapon, and fell into the dust. Silence followed, broken only by the horse's frantic breathing. Clara's chest heaved, her hands trembling violently, but she did not step back. She moved forward instead into the street, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. The remaining riders hesitated, their bravado faltering under her gaze. She lifted her chin, her voice steady now, louder. "We're done hiding. This is our home." The words rang against the buildings, carried into the silence of the watching town. Though no faces appeared at windows, Clara knew they heard. She felt the weight of their listening, their judgment shifting, however slightly, as her voice cut through the night. The riders exchanged uneasy glances. One spat, muttered a curse, and turned his horse. Another followed, leaving their leader's body sprawled in the dust. The sound of retreating hooves faded into the dark, leaving only silence behind. Matthew lowered his revolver, his chest rising and falling with controlled breath. Clara turned to him, her body trembling with exhaustion, fear, something deeper. For a long moment neither spoke. Then he stepped closer, his hand brushing lightly against her arm, not a claim but a reassurance. She did not pull away. Around them the town remained quiet, but the silence felt different now, less suffocating, more watchful. Clara lifted her eyes to the horizon, where the first stars glimmered against the dark. The danger was not gone, not entirely, but something had shifted. She had found her voice, and with it, a piece of herself she thought she had lost. She turned back toward the cabin, the rosebush trembling faintly in the night wind. Its bloom, fragile yet unbroken, caught her gaze. She reached out, her fingers brushing the petals, and felt a steadiness return to her chest. Inside, Matthew placed his revolver on the table, the metal still warm from use. Clara watched him, her voice low but certain. "They'll come again." "Yes," he said. She stepped closer, her eyes holding his. "Then we'll be ready." The words settled between them like an oath, fragile yet fierce, binding them not by circumstance but by choice. The night held its breath once more, waiting for dawn. The dawn rose slow, spilling pale gold across the desert, touching the ridge with a glow that seemed almost merciful after the night's violence. Clara stood outside the cabin, the hem of her dress heavy with dust, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the earth and sky pressed close. The town lay still behind her, its streets marked by silence rather than smoke or blood, yet she knew whispers already stirred within shuttered homes. They would speak of how Cain had faced the riders, how she herself had stood in the doorway and shouted them down. The story would spread, altered in each retelling, but for once she would not be its victim. Matthew moved quietly beside her, his presence steady as the sun climbing higher. He had said little after the fighting, his words as scarce as ever, yet she felt him in every motion, the way his hand rested near hers as though offering steadiness without demanding it. He studied the horizon too, as though expecting the riders to return, but his shoulders carried less tension now, his posture no longer braced for impact. Clara watched him, tracing the lines of fatigue and restraint in his face, and for the first time she wondered not just what battles he had fought but what they had cost him in silence. Behind them, the rosebush stood bent but not broken, its bloom trembling faintly in the dawn light. Clara's gaze lingered on it, the fragile petals like a small rebellion against dust and violence. Something within her shifted at the sight, a quiet recognition that survival was not merely endurance, it was choosing to bloom despite the weight of dust. The town began to stir. Doors opened cautiously, boots scuffed against wood, voices low and uncertain. Clara turned, watching figures emerge, their faces wary, eyes glancing between her and Matthew. Some looked away quickly, shame written in their downcast gazes. Others lingered, curiosity masking cowardice. The saloon keeper leaned against his doorway, his usual grin replaced with a studied neutrality. "They'll watch us," Clara murmured. Matthew's voice was even, calm. "Let them." His words settled like stones in her chest, grounding her. She drew a breath, lifting her chin, and together they walked into the town's main street. Dust swirled at their feet, carrying traces of the night's chaos. The leader's body had been taken by his men, but the marks of struggle remained, the scuffs of hooves, the ash of burned lantern oil, the faint dark stains that spoke of blood spilled. Townsfolk skirted the evidence, careful not to meet their eyes. At the general store, Mrs. Hollis stood clutching her apron, her face pale. She muttered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a judgment, but Clara did not slow her step. She felt Matthew's hand brush against hers again, not holding, simply there. That small gesture gave her strength enough to keep walking. When they reached the saloon, the laughter that usually spilled through its doors was absent. Men shifted uneasily at tables, their eyes darting toward them. Clara stopped in the doorway, her voice quiet but carrying. "We fought because no one else would," she said, her words measured, not accusing yet impossible to ignore. "We stood because silence would have killed us faster than bullets. And we will not bow our heads anymore." The room remained hushed. Glasses sat untouched, hands fidgeted, gazes fell. For once, their silence felt smaller than hers. Clara turned away, her pulse pounding, but a weight had lifted from her chest. She had spoken, and they had listened, even if their shame kept them silent. Matthew walked beside her back to the cabin, his expression unchanged, though she caught the faintest flicker in his eyes, something like respect deepening. He did not praise her, and she did not expect it. His quiet acknowledgement was enough. The day passed slow, heavy with waiting. Though the riders had retreated, danger still lingered at the edges of thought. Clara moved through the cabin with restless hands, tending to chores yet pausing often at the window. Each sound beyond the ridge set her heart quickening, though no riders came. Matthew mended a chair, his calm patience a contrast to her anxious pacing. As evening fell, Clara set bread and stew upon the table. They ate in silence, but it was not emptiness. It was the quiet of two who had weathered a storm and found themselves still standing. She caught his gaze once, steady and unwavering, and felt heat rise in her cheeks. She looked away quickly, though her chest carried a warmth she had not felt in years. Later, as the stars spread wide across the sky, Matthew stepped outside, his figure outlined in silver light. Clara followed, drawn by something unspoken. The desert stretched endless before them, each star sharp as though etched against the dark. She stood near him, her shawl drawn close, her breath visible in the cool night. "Do you think they'll come again?" she asked, her voice low. "Yes," he said simply. Then after a pause, "But so will we." She turned toward him, searching his face, and found not bravado but quiet certainty. He did not speak of victory, only of standing, of enduring together. Something within her softened, the last brittle edges of fear dissolving into trust. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his palm upward, allowing her to rest her hand in his. The touch was simple, unadorned, yet it carried the weight of everything unsaid, the promises unspoken, the respect hard-earned, the tenderness carefully grown in silence. For the first time in years, Clara felt the possibility of a future that did not taste of ashes. The weeks that followed brought change, slow but certain. The town, once quick to whisper, began to watch differently. Neighbors who had turned their backs now offered nods, hesitant at first, then warmer. Clara walked the streets with her head higher, her steps no longer hurried. The saloon no longer echoed with cruel jokes at her expense. Instead, men spoke of the night Matthew Kane had stood alone against 4 riders, though she knew the truth, that she had stood as well, and that together they had claimed a life beyond fear. One evening, under the glow of lantern light, Matthew spoke words she had not expected but had quietly hoped for. "We could marry," he said, his voice steady, as though offering a practical solution rather than a plea. Clara felt her throat tighten. Marriage had once been a dream turned to ash, a promise broken when she fled the city. Yet now, standing in the quiet of her cabin with Matthew's gaze steady on hers, it felt different. Not an escape, not a rescue, but a choice. "Yes," she whispered, and the word felt like freedom. They wed in the small church at the edge of town. The ceremony was simple, the pews filled sparsely, yet the air carried a reverence that needed no grandeur. Clara's hands trembled as she held his, but when his thumb brushed lightly against her skin, steadiness returned. Vows were spoken with clarity, not flourish, and when silence followed, it was filled with meaning deeper than words. The gossip did not vanish overnight, but it softened. Whispers turned into stories of endurance, of defiance, of survival. Clara no longer felt like prey beneath their eyes. She felt like a woman who had claimed her place, and beside her stood a man who did not need to speak love aloud for it to be known in every gesture. Seasons shifted. The rosebush outside the cabin grew stronger, its blooms more numerous, its roots deepening in the soil. Clara tended it often, her fingers brushing petals with quiet devotion, each bloom a reminder of fragility turned resilient. One spring evening, Clara sat near the window, her hand resting against the swell of her belly. The life stirring within her filled her with awe and fear alike, yet more than either, with hope. She thought of the letter she had once written in desperation. "You promised to protect me, tonight they'll kill me." Those words had been a plea. Now they felt like a memory belonging to someone else, a woman who had not yet discovered her own voice. Matthew entered, his presence filling the room with its steady calm. He set his hand gently atop hers, his rough palm warm against her skin. She looked up at him and for the first time allowed herself to smile fully, without restraint. "We'll raise them strong," she said softly. He nodded, his eyes holding hers, his silence carrying agreement deeper than speech. Outside, the desert stretched vast and unbroken, yet the cabin stood rooted, a small defiance against emptiness. The town, once hostile, had bent, and though danger would always linger beyond the ridge, Clara knew they would face it together. As the night deepened, she stepped outside, the air cool against her cheeks, the stars scattered like seeds across the sky. Matthew stood beside her, his hand finding hers once more. The rose bush brushed against her skirt, its blooms trembling in the breeze yet refusing to break. Clara lifted her eyes to the horizon, where darkness met starlight, and felt no fear. She had survived, she had spoken, she had chosen. The silence around them was no longer heavy, it was full, brimming with promise. And when the wind carried dust across the plain, it did not feel like a threat. It felt like the breath of a land that had tried to break her and failed. She leaned into Matthew's steady presence, her fingers tightening around his. For the first time she did not look back at what had been lost. She looked forward, toward a life built not on promises broken but on choices made together. The rose bloomed in the desert, fragile and fierce, and so did she.